It's time for another installment of This Day in History. In our last episode, we looked at the devastating Halifax explosion of 1917, and today we're going to look at a disaster that happened 2 years later, just north of Boston, in the city of Everett, Massachusetts. But instead of an explosive mixture of coal and sawdust, this disaster involved over 2 million gallons of sweet molasses. Welcome to the Great Molasses Flood. On January 15, 1919, a storage tank filled with sweet New England molasses was being prepared for shipment on a large schooner named the Progress. The tank was owned by the United Molasses Company and was located at their terminal on the north side of Commercial Street near the Chelsea Creek Bridge. At the time, there were 3 other ships docked alongside the Progress. These ships would transport molasses to be used in making Boston cream pie, a local specialty. At 12:35 p.m., as workers were preparing to fill the ship, they noticed a leak in the tank. Although the hole was small, it was leaking faster than expected and spreading across the wooden dock. To stop the flow, the workers closed valves that had been left open to allow air into the tank. As they did this, the pressure inside the tank rose. Now when molasses is heated or agitated, it expands in volume. This process is called sparging. Happens because the gas bubbles in the molasses are released and expand, causing the liquid to rise. Now, people aren't sure exactly what caused the tank to explode, but they think that closing the valves so quickly caused the pressure inside the tank to rise very rapidly. Then, for unknown reasons, some of the molasses boiled, which lowered its density, causing even more gas bubbles to come out of solution and further increasing the pressure. Whatever happened, the tank could not contain the pressure and exploded. One witness said it was like the rising of the dead. The force of the explosion was tremendous. Eyewitnesses compared it to the force of a large bomb or an earthquake. The blast blew the top off the 50-foot tank and sent a huge wave of molasses rushing through the streets of Everett. Estimates of the wave's height vary from 10 to 25 feet. That's about the height of a 2-story building. Molasses floods out of the tank and rushes toward the nearby docks where people are trying to load it onto ships. The first wave hits the street in front of the factory and pushes back toward the source. People flee in terror as the wave approaches them. One person who stood in its path described it as black as ink, like a tidal wave. They said it was impossible to breathe, and the stench of burning molasses filled the air. The wave continued on until it hit the Chelsea Street Bridge, where it fell into the creek. There it turned around and headed back toward the factory, gaining speed and strength with each return. The returning wave crashed into the remaining molasses tank, sending more molasses flooding into the streets. The whole town smelled like burnt sugar, and the ground heaved as if an earthquake had struck. With no warning, the wave rolled through the streets of Everett at 35 miles per hour. People tried to run away from the wave, but many were trapped by its sheer force. Those who couldn't get out of its path dove for cover behind whatever they could find. The wave knocked down walls and overturned trucks, cars, and locomotives. It broke windows, snapped telephone lines, and tore apart buildings. Some witnesses said it sounded like a freight train. Others said it was like a hurricane. An engineer who saw the wave coming saw a man standing on the corner of Commercial Street and Ferryway. He watched as the wave approached, and then he saw him dive for cover behind a pile of boxes. But the wave knocked the boxes over and swept him up into its roiling mass. There were 21 people in Everett who didn't wake up that night. Their day started with the smell of sweet molasses, but ended with the sticky taste of death. Most of the victims were women and children who were at home at the time of the disaster. Of the 21 who died, 6 were African American, but only 1 was identified and buried. She was a domestic worker who lived with a white family and was attending a church social when the wave hit. Her name was Maggie Mitchell, and she was 24 years old. No one knows how many African Americans actually lived in Everett at the time of the disaster, but it's thought that they may have been undercounted in official reports because of the racism of the time period. Over 150 people were also injured during the flood. One survivor said, "I have never seen such a horrible sight." Women were lying on the ground with their dresses torn off, hands and feet cut off, scalded and mangled. Men were in the same condition. Survivors crawled out of the wreckage and stood around dazed, covered with molasses from head to toe. They wandered around not knowing what had happened or why their towns looked like this. Rescuers arrived and began to pull survivors from the wreckage. Many of the victims were rushed to hospitals, but there weren't enough doctors or nurses to go around. Even if they had been able to help everyone, there was a severe shortage of supplies. The disaster happened on a Sunday, and most of the doctors were attending church services, while many of the nurses had gone home for the weekend. There were also no fire engines available. The Everett Fire Department had attended a convention in Atlantic City, ironically. The previous week, the department had voted to purchase a new fire engine, but they needed the money. So they postponed voting on the purchase until after the new year, and since the tank wasn't full, they thought there was no need to test the alarm system. Instead, the call went out over the telephone, as did calls for medical help. With no trained professionals available, residents took charge. An Army veteran helped amputate a man's leg. A woman who worked for the American Red Cross organized a kitchen to feed the survivors. Other residents donated food and clothing. A local minister led a group of men to help carry victims into a church basement, which was being used as a makeshift hospital. Cleanup from the molasses flood took months. Workers spread sawdust over the sticky streets to make them easier to navigate. They scraped the goo off the sidewalks and poured gasoline on the ground to break it up. What little remained was put into trucks and hauled away. To prevent something like this from happening again, the remaining molasses tanks were emptied and torn down. The site was cleaned up, and a new factory was built on the property. In 1920, the United Molasses Company merged with another company, and the new entity became known as the New England Molasses Company. They continued shipping molasses until 1984. Today, the site of the flood is occupied by a cement factory. This video comes with a quiz that lets you check how much you remember. Thanks for watching.